Hello and welcome to West Leake. I'm Mike Saunders, the chairman of the East Leake District Local History Society, and I live here in West Leake. West Leake is first mentioned in the Domesday Book, like many other villages. It's never been a large village. When this map was published at the start of the 20th century, there were only about 20 houses and cottages in the village. And even now there are only 40. During the course of the 20th century there was some infilling, particularly on the meadows on the north side of the village street, but some dwellings have disappeared, notably a pair of thatched cottages near the churchyard entrance which were destroyed by fire within living memory. At the turn of the 20th century the village was mainly engaged in agriculture, although there were a couple of small industries in the area. It is now mainly a commuter village. During the course of the late 20th century, as the farm tenancies expired, Lord Belper's Kingston Hall estate took over management of the land, and the farmhouses and buildings were sold off, the latter being converted into dwellings, of which there are 8. We will start out on our tour of the village from here. This building is one of the older ones remaining in the village, the footprint of it being shown on an estate map of 1759. It is likely to have been a cattle or beast shed, the doorways being 8 foot high but only 5 feet wide, so they would not have admitted a cart or wagon. Further evidence of it being a beast shed is that there is an internal rendering on the walls to protect the bricks from animal excretia. The building is divided into 4 bays of approximately 11 feet. The wall containing the doors has brickwork 14 inches thick, while the remainder is 9 inches. Unfortunately, the original roof structure was replaced in the 1970s when the building was converted without any record being made. The carved stone blocks support the hinge pintles for the door, which are leaded in. It appears that there were only single doors to the opening, and that these closed directly into the brickwork rather than into a wooden frame. If one looks carefully at the brickwork to the left of the door, it will be seen that the bricks vary considerably in size, some being only 2 inches thick while they are 10 inches long, while others further up the wall are 3 inches thick but only 9 inches long. They were likely to have been made at one of the local 2 brickyards, one of which continued to work until the mid-20th century, but it should be borne in mind that each brickmaker had his own moulding box. Standard sized bricks did not appear before the brick tax of 1784. The bricks are laid on thin lime mortar beds and were double struck pointed, a time consuming task. The bricks are laid to a bond but is not a generally recognised one. The mortar is very hard. When an additional window opening, albeit quite large, was cut through the front wall, the builder estimated it would take a week to cut out and prepare. It actually took a fortnight. From here we'll go across the road to the church. The north wall of the nave represents the oldest standing structure in the village and could well date from the Saxon period. There have been a number of alterations and additions and a major rebuild of the church in the late 19th century. The east window of the chancel suggests 14th century work, and both the chancel and the south aisle may have been originally constructed at the same time. An early photograph of the church shows both the nave and chancel with low pitched roofs, presumably covered with lead, but the nave may have originally had a steeply pitched thatched roof. The pitched roof on the nave was introduced when the church was rebuilt in 1886, together with the pitched roof to the north transept. The south aisle was completely rebuilt at this time. It seems possible that the church originally was a cell of Breedon on the Hill Priory. This is the oldest remaining part of the building. Sir Roy Strong, a former director of the Victoria and Albert Museum, suggests in his book A Little History of the English Country Churches that Saxon masons built perpendicular walls, as this one is, while Norman masons were happier building walls with a very pronounced batter. The original walls probably reached only as high as the clerestory windows, but the architect's plan for the 1886 restoration indicate that the upper section of the wall was to be completely replaced. The lower section of the wall, up as far as the weathering, would appear to be later work, but if the sections above are carefully examined, it can be seen that the masons initially worked with the largest stones available, then gradually worked down through the medium-sized ones to the smaller fragments, finally topping them off with 2 courses of tiles, which may have marked the end of a season's building work. Lime mortar will freeze in bad weather and would then disintegrate. The source of the stone used is not known. It could have been the Leake Hills, where both limestone and gypsum have previously been mined. This stone coffin, currently in use as a bulb planter, lays by the north wall of the transept. It is not known where in the church it came from, and it is possible that it has been displaced from within the walls of the transept, where the most important monument is, during the 1886 rebuild. It also seems possible that the transept was originally a chantry chapel, but has now become a position for the organ and the vestry. The coffin is actually broken in two, but the 2 pieces have been pushed together for its present use. Further along the nave wall are several cross stones or coffin lids. These might have been the covers for the 3 monumental effigies to be found in the church, but numerous ventilation ducts and flues were installed under the floor during the Victorian restoration, and floor slabs and perhaps burials were disturbed. The faculty allowing this work to go ahead is very limited in detail. The left-hand image shows a fragment of one of the stones with the upper arm of the cross missing, while the right-hand image depicts a stone which has been cut down, possibly to form a lintel, the cross shaft no longer being central on the stone. Now we come to 2 of the features in the north wall of the nave. The head of the window in the left-hand image is cut from a single block of stone, as can be seen, which is very typical of the work of the Saxon period, and is reminiscent of the windows in the Saxon church at Escombe in County Durham. As with many narrow windows, it is well splayed internally. The north doorway, otherwise known as the Devil's Door, has at some time been blocked, possibly to reduce cross draughts. The north door was used in the medieval period as part of the rite of baptism. Both north and south doors of the church would be left open during the service so that any evil spirits displaced by the baptism could be blown outside. The door opening is very simple, without any mouldings, the only embellishments being carvings of the imposts, which are still visible in a good light. The left-hand side of the opening is far better work than that on the right, suggesting that the corner of the nave has at some time been rebuilt. The sloping weathering and 2 courses of masonry are presumably an attempt to protect the wall from rising damp, and it is of interest to note that the architect for the Victorian restoration provided a ventilation duct outside the north wall and around the west end of the nave for the same reason. Entering the church via the south door of the nave, one is met by the early perpendicular arches of the south arcade. These and their associated pillars are original, but both the south aisle and the clerestory were rebuilt in 1886. If one looks carefully at the mouldings on the heads of the pillars, small traces of red pigment can be found, suggesting the church was a colourful place during the medieval period. Traces of the red pigment can also be found on 2 of the monuments in the church. The first of the 3 monuments to be examined is in the south aisle, behind the extremely long backed form which runs all along this aisle wall. This is the first monument we will look at, and it represents a man in civilian clothing rather than the more familiar armour. The style of the carving on the monument suggests it might be earlier than the actual arcade, meaning that the memorial may have been displaced from elsewhere within the church. The person's identity is unknown, but it might just represent a member of the Booge or Boge family who were wealthy Nottingham wool merchants and who acquired a holding in the manor from the De Ferrus family of Tetbury, who were the major landholders in the area. This lady's monument is located in the sanctuary near the altar, suggesting she was a person of high status, but we do not know who. Like the civilian in the south aisle, her monument does not quite fit into the recess in the wall. The effigy depicts her holding the neck of her robe with the left hand, while her right hand demurely holds the folds of her robe lower down. This is one of the monuments with faint traces of red pigment. This monument should be considered the treasure of the church, but has ended up with an organ planted in front of it. It seems likely that this transept was a chantry chapel, suggesting the person commemorated had both wealth and status. The effigy is clad in civilian robes and holds his heart in his hands, while his feet rest on a mutilated creature, presumably a dog. What appears to be hair around his face is actually two angels assisting his soul to heaven. The only monument with similar symbolism is the tomb of Edward II in Gloucester Cathedral. Now, in the summer of 2018, we commemorated the 700th anniversary of the Treaty of Leake, when Edward spent 3 days in the area while his scribes drew up a treaty between he and his cousin Edmund of Lancaster, one of the terms of which prevented any fortifications in the area, hence no castles other than Castle Donington and Nottingham, which will both predate the agreement. The person depicted could just be John de Leake, who might well have gained favour and a coat of arms for entertaining Edward. Following the path out through the lower corner of the churchyard, down the steps in the ha-ha, one comes to a meadow containing a number of undulations. This particular hollow is part full of water following heavy rain, and it may well represent the village mill dam. There were probably 2 water mills in the Kingston Brook, one at Kingston and the other here at West Leake. There is confirmation of the existence of these mills. Old documents refer to the derelict state of that at Kingston, while another is a sad entry in the West Leake church registers noting the burial of a child drowned in the mill dam. The image is taken from the probable position of the dam itself and shows the considerable quantity of water which accumulates from just groundwater and a heavy rainfall, the level of the brook being now lower than the mill dam or pond. If we leave this meadow by the bridge in the distance and turn to the right, it will bring us along to our next site, the moat. Following the brook downstream from the bridge, we come to the moated site, which would really be best seen from the air. There are 3 banks which are at present dry, the 4th boundary being formed by the Kingston Brook. Little is known of the structure, the earliest representation being on the 1759 estate map, which appears to show a formal garden within the enclosure. Within the 1970s, the now defunct Derby School carried out a dig led by their classics master, but no written report of this dig has been found. It could have been a fortified enclosure or a pleasure garden. We just don't know. The only thing that can be remembered from the dig was that a cobbled area was found within the enclosure. This was local cobbles, not granite sets, and it is noticed that the upper northwest corner of the banks are just a bit higher than the surrounding area. As mentioned earlier, there were a couple of small industries in the area. The first mentioned was brickmaking, while the second was basket making. In the 1820s, one of the younger members of the Mills family, who lived here in West Leake, went to Ratcliffe-upon-Soar to learn basket making, and later returned to West Leake as a journeyman basket making, with the basket maker's daughter from Ratcliffe-on-Soar as his wife. They set up a workshop at the premises later to be known as the Basket, the village alehouse, which strangely is not mentioned in the register of licensed premises held in Nott's archives. Early maps suggest that the site initially extended over where the next door pair of semi-detached houses now stand. This area may well have contained both a storage shed for the withies, or osier rods, term being interchangeable, and a working area. After a period of time, another member of the family decided to set up as a basket maker at the far more open village of East Leake, where the two factories run by the Mills family employed around 100 people. The fact that the Mills were Methodists may have helped this decision. The premises here at West Leake have changed quite considerably over the years. The rear two-storey building was the alehouse, the entrance to which was where the white window behind the car is at present. The present owner recalls that there was a cellar beneath the alehouse, presumably intended to store the ale, but this was filled in during renovations. In the corner of the building, behind the blue plaque, is a brick-built copper, which was likely to have been used as part in the brewing process. The left-hand image shows what remains of the West Leake osier or withy beds, situated in the meadow between Brickyard Lane and Pithouse Lane. The beds are still rather marshy, although they are mainly filled with rushes, which can be seen in the foreground of the photograph, while some withy bearing catkins and early leaves can be seen in the mid-distance. The withy beds here at West Leake were the biggest in the area, probably serving a number of basket makers. It is interesting to note that the beds were enlarged as the basket making industry was in decline in the village, suggesting other makers were being supplied. These beds, although adjacent to the Kingston Brook, were fed with water from the Leake Sick, a small intermittent stream which flowed down from the nearby hills. The story of Townend Farm is very convoluted and concerns the Mansfields, who were lords of the manor, the Wild family from here in the village, and the Bird family from Barrow-upon-Soar. The Wild family is first mentioned here in the village in 1560, when one of the Wilds was churchwarden, and they are noted down as being of an ancient family. Over the years between the 16th and 18th century, the Wilds, who must have owned land and property here in the village, sold several holdings to the Mansfields, but in 1732 another family, the Birds, apparently leased land they must have owned here in the village to the then lord of the manor, Thomas Mansfield III. This land became known as the Bird freehold. When Thomas died, his heir and nephew, Evelyn Chadwick, inherited the manor, and in 1742 Evelyn came to an agreement with the rector that he would become the owner of the land, forming the Bird freehold, and the rector would receive an annual annuity. The fact that the Birds actually owned the land seemed to have been conveniently forgotten. Following the change of landlord, one of the Wild family moved from West Leake Farm, the location of which is unknown but might now just be the manor, to what was to become Townend Farm. The Wild family retained the tenancy until 1799, when the Birds sold the freehold, which they had recovered, to a Mr. Trowell of Derby. Perhaps the Birds regretted this, for in 1806 they can be found giving financial help to another Wild family to purchase the Bird freehold back from Mr. Trowell. In 1820 Matthew Wild had this splendid farmhouse built, although the earlier farmhouse still exists in the crew yard, the area where the cattle were brought in for milking and often overwintered. Unfortunately, by 1833, Matthew had run into financial difficulties and was forced to sell the farm to the then Lord Middleton, but he seems to have remained as tenant until he died in 1844, leaving his widow to continue with the tenancy until 1854, when she too died, followed not long after by her son, who had become the tenant. This son's widow also continued to manage the farm until 1867, when the Lord Belper acquired the whole of the estate and the Wilds moved away. After passing through the hands of a couple of tenants, the farm was taken over in the 1930s by the Alsop family, who were the last to farm this land before the manor was taken over by the Kingston Hall estates. Our penultimate slide concerns people rather than buildings or a place. This is the wedding of Laura Johnson and Harold Knight. Now, Laura was a Nottingham girl from Beeston, and her mother managed to get her a post as a student assistant at Nottingham School of Art, and it was there that she met her husband-to-be, Harold. She was apparently a determined young woman, and biographies suggest that it was she who proposed to Harold rather than vice versa. We don't know the connection to West Leake, but the wedding photograph here is taken outside Schoolside Farm, and the window behind the group actually still exists. Another photograph shows she and Harold getting into a carriage which is apparently heading in the direction of West Leake, perhaps to catch a train to go on honeymoon. Now, the Knights started out their married life at Staithes, up in North Yorkshire, where they had a studio in the actual village, but lived at one of the surrounding villages. Here Laura developed her painting skills, because there was a group of painters here at Staithes. From there they moved to Newlyn in Cornwall, which was rapidly becoming an artist's commune, where she painted a number of very delicate landscapes. Finally, the couple moved to London, and that's possibly where she became best known, when she became an official war artist. And the picture that she painted during that time that I like best is the one of a young woman in a South Wales munitions factory machining the breech of a 3-inch gun on a metalworking lathe. The fall of light is especially well rendered. The young woman portrayed in this picture became for a while a minor celebrity. Now, our final slide is one of the marriage certificate at West Leake Church. Now, one biography states that she and Harold were married at Staithes, while another says Newlyn in Cornwall. But here we have proof that she was actually married here at West Leake. At the time of their marriage, Harold was 29 and gives his occupation as an artist, whilst Laura was 25 and is a spinster, but does not give any profession, possibly as was customary at the time. Harold's father was an architect, while Laura's was an ironmonger. Now, I hope you've enjoyed our little tour around the village, and I hope sometime in the future it may be possible for you to come and join me for an actual walk around in person. I hope you've enjoyed the virtual tour.